The Canterbury Tales. 6 centuries after it was written, Chaucer's opus remains a startling work. A resplendent feat of storytelling and social commentary, the tale's influence on literature and English itself has been profound. Perhaps this explains the continual urge towards its adaptation, an urge seen as early as 1634 with William Shakespeare and John Fletcher's The Two Noble Kinsmen. Since that time, a dizzying array of adaptations and appropriations of Chaucer's work have come to pass. Today, we're going to focus on one of these adaptations, Pier Paolo Pasolini's 1972 film, I racconti di Canterbury, the second installment of his trilogy of life. Pasolini, a controversial Italian poet and filmmaker, stands as a strange analogue to Chaucer himself. Both were poets who utilized vernacular dialects, both evaluated and critiqued the societal constructs of their times through their work, and interestingly, both took inspiration from Boccaccio's Decameron. So when Pasolini approaches the Canterbury Tales, he does so as a poet and an author. It's a critical perspective that influences nearly all aspects of the adaptation. However, film is a visual medium, and while Chaucer's poetry is highly evocative, there are few direct images associated with the Canterbury Tales, besides those of illuminated manuscripts such as the Ellesmere Chaucer, which, while stunning, offers little more than small pictorial figures, almost ideogrammatic in nature, and not the vibrant, arresting representations needed to guide an essentially visual adaptation. This naturally raises the question of where Pasolini drew inspiration from in order to realize his richly imagined and visually striking film. Enter Peter Bruegel the Elder and Hieronymus Bosch. Considered together, Bruegel and Bosch offer a captivating visual parallel to Chaucer's text. Bruegel's animated depictions of peasant life seem almost capable of serving as illustrations to the pilgrim portraits of the general prologue, and Bosch's strange, apocalyptic compositions radiantly articulate Chaucer's often darkly humorous portrayals of death, hell, and the sins of man. And when viewed in context with Pasolini's cinema as a whole, this choice becomes clear. Pasolini had often made stylistic use of Renaissance art, as shown here, and as this sequence from Pasolini's earlier film of the Decameron demonstrates, was already employing Bruegel as an illustrative lens for literary adaptation. In this impressive tableau vivant, we see the representations of several Bruegel paintings, most prominently his 1559 work, The Fight Between Carnival and Lent. Patrick Rumble writes that this tableau offers the director the opportunity to contaminate the filmic with the painterly, to mix languages, draw our attention to the expressive textures and materials of film, and reconnect film to a long history of visual codes that predate motion pictures, but nevertheless culminate in the cinema. It was Pasolini's way of giving expression to what he called an eclecticism at the heart of his cinema of poetry. Thus, when it came time to manifest Chaucer's text on screen, we see that the precedent had already been set. Now, we're going to explore how Pasolini translates the lingual artifact of Chaucer's Middle English to the living visual of film, to the figurative traditions of Bruegel and Bosch, and we're going to do it in 3 parts. Vision and the act of seeing appears as a recurring motif in I racconti di Canterbury. Pasolini begins the film with glimpses of the pilgrims' faces, whose physiognomies strikingly evoke Bruegel's peasant portraits. And we see it continued in January's ogling of May, the fiend's dangerous gaze, Perkin the reveler's farcical gape, and the wife of Bath's covetous glance. The precedence and peril of vision marks Pasolini's adaptation, and is initially explored in The Merchant's Tale, the first of the film's 8. Here we see how the aged January's desiring gaze of his young bride May turns to blindness, opening the way for the libidinous Damien to woo May himself. However, through divine intervention, January's sight is restored in time for him to catch May and Damien philandering in a fruit tree. Horrified at what his unintentional act of voyeurism has revealed, January berates his wife for her faithlessness. Thus, through the literal lens of Pasolini's cinema, Chaucer's fabula becomes a parable on sight itself, both its power and its fallibility. Indeed, in the end, May calms her husband's protestations not by suggesting that her infidelity was purposed to restore January's sight, as in Chaucer's text, but instead by insisting that January's vision of her dalliance was itself faulty. Her lie eclipses his vision, and placated by her beauty, January slips into a new blindness, that of self-selected denial. In The Friar's Tale, the fiend follows closely behind the summoner, his burning, all-seeing gaze sweeping over humanity. Pasolini equates the fiend with the church by showing him walking in step with a procession of nuns, which only the camera notices. This anti-clerical view is cemented when the fiend turns, staring straight into the lens, as if challenging the audience to distinguish him from the clergy. In a sequence entirely of Pasolini's imagination, one man, unable to pay the summoner off, is burned to death. His frantic screams and contorted struggling is contrasted with the eager glance of the fiend and the silent and passive gaze of the crowd, which echoes the grouping of people clustered around the sermonizing St. John the Baptist in Bruegel's 1556 work, thus implicitly reinforcing the conception of the burning as a religious act, and furthering Pasolini's and to some degree Chaucer's critique of the operations of the church. In the final twist of the tale, the summoner, who depended on awareness and perception for his livelihood, is damned to hell, destroyed by his own short-sightedness, and his failure to see the fiend's true intentions and true prey. Thus, sight is revealed as a powerful and destructive force, the weapon of fiends, both metaphorical and metaphysical. In a nod to Charlie Chaplin, Chaucer's abrupt tale of the cook is turned to an episode of farcical slapstick, with Perkin the Reveler taking on the persona of Chaplin's eternal tramp. Perkin falls in with a wedding party where we're treated to a jocular pastiche of Bruegel's peasant wedding and the wedding dance. In the peasant wedding, the groom is conspicuously absent. While here the groom is present, we see him first overlooked in favor of the carousing Perkin, and then explicitly erased, whited out by a tumbling cake. Furthermore, in Pasolini's adaptation, vision plays into the structural fabric of the film itself. At the beginning of racconti di Canterbury, Chaucer, played notably by Pasolini himself, stands in the liminal space of a gateway, about to enter what we knew to be essentially a world of his own creation. Significantly, while the impetus behind the tales of Pilgrimage to Canterbury remains the same, the frame story of Chaucer's text has been eschewed. Except for the wife of Bath, the pilgrim narratives do not appear again after this first sequence. This ironically imparts the film with the same fragmentary nature of Chaucer's text as a whole. Additionally, it adds increased importance to Pasolini's portrayal of Chaucer, as the short interludes featuring the Chaucer character figures the only non-diegetic inserts in the film, such as this moment after the cook's tale, when a mirthful Chaucer sets to work after reading from the Decameron. And it may be supposed that Pasolini's portrayal of Chaucer, in its own way, actually instigates a partial frame story. When we consider that Pasolini as director mirrors the real-life position of Chaucer as author, we can recognize that by taking the role of Chaucer on screen, Pasolini initiates the same type of meta-narrative that Chaucer creates with his pilgrim storytellers, except removed by one step. Now the pseudo-game of oral storytelling turned to the real literature of Chaucer's text is replaced by the film's image of Chaucer writing the stories himself, which thus renders the act of viewing the film as the metaphorical equivalent of reading the text. And it's an important point. Pasolini does not strive for narrative, but for the poetic, the expression of an inner vision, mediated through Bruegel and Bosch's outer images. Thus, the gaze of the camera itself takes on the qualities of the written word, transforming the process of reading into the act of seeing. Truly, Pasolini's cinema of poetry made manifest. The famed Italian critic Lino Machice once noted that Pasolini's cinema is united by an ideology of death. And indeed, the specter of death and damnation hangs heavily over Racconti di Canterbury. Pasolini himself considered the film to be the darkest of his trilogy of life, and certainly this is visually substantiated. The shadows are heavy, and grays and blacks dominate the palette, broken by spurts of symbolic crimson. This is most prominently witnessed in The Wife of Bath's tale, where the wife is swathed entirely in this particular shade of red, portending her as an arbiter of both desire and death, and making her a striking double of the figure of pride in Bosch's The Seven Deadly Sins. In the beginning of the episode, we see the wife exhausting her fourth husband with her insatiable desire. The wife makes business of love and strives for agency through the total possession of her husbands, which includes mastery over their very existence. Indeed, after becoming infatuated with the clerk Jenkin, the wife plans to seduce and marry him. Consequently, her current husband is rendered superfluous, and accordingly upon returning home we find him dying, subsumed by her will and her unquenchable prurience, thus rendering her almost a succubus. This link is further illustrated in this scene, where the wife speaks with Jenkin.
I came here to speak to you, Jenkin.
Speak.
Well, Jenkin, you have bewitched me. It's useless to deny. All night long I dreamed of you. You tried to kill me. As I lay down on my back, and the bed was full of blood. So you have to marry me, Jenkin.
But I'm yet too young.
You know, my husband croaks his last. And all the people who understand such things agree. It's a fortunate dream. Blood means gold.
While the metaphors are clear, the imagery is still significant. The wife of Bath dreams of blood and death, framing Jenkin as an incubus, as well as presaging the end of the tale, when her dream of violence is realized.
You've killed me. Come here. One last kiss. The last.
Forgive me. I beseech you.
Yes, I forgive you.
In the Pardoner's Tale, this exploration of death is manifested into a literal exploration for death, with predictable results. And the visual darkness of Pasolini's adaptation reaches its culmination when the three youths who have set out to find the thief, Death, finally achieve their goal. Silhouetted against the sky, their deaths become performance, a shadow play backlit by a sun that could as easily be hellfire. They stumble about, caught in the mortal haze of their greed. This bleak portrait of death in the face of such an illuminating quality of light brings to mind the spurts of hellfire in Bosch's Last Judgment, and foreshadows the true vision of hell that we will soon witness. This vision of hell arrives in the form of the Summoner's Tale, a Boschian nightmare fully formed with wild, body abandon. It's an obscene tour de force, culminating in the final image of the devil excreting 20,000 friars. The pure access shown in the staging of this particularly graphic visual from Chaucer may seem to mark it as an invention of Pasolini's. However, there is a visual precedent at work. Bosch's 1501 Temptation of St. Anthony demonstrates a similar scatological view of the devil, and indeed, the entire sequence briskly references a large swath of Bruegel and Bosch's iconography, most prominently Bosch's Hell panel in the Garden of Earthly Delights, and Bruegel's Triumph of Death. Completed in the period between 1490 and 1510, Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights stands as a mesmerizing and fantastical vision. The Hell panel transforms classical ideas of damnation, brimstone and hellfire, tortured bodies and restless demons, into a unique lexicon of grotesque dream imagery that confronts us with its primal strangeness. However, like Chaucer and Pasolini, Bosch's work does more than simply astound. If we consider that in 1517, accounts record that the work hung in the Nassau Palace in Brussels, and that the work is conjectured to have been commissioned by Hendrik III, Count of Nassau-Breda, the triptych takes on a subversive element, and a further glossing of its imagery unearths the subtle warning on the interconnected nature of power, pleasure, and sin that would have been more readily apparent to the courtly audience in the Nassau Palace. For example, we see the inversion of the royal hunt, where man is now mauled by monstrous hounds, while the supposed prey, the rabbit, readies its pike for the death blow. Giant musical instruments, the representations of earthly pleasure and courtly sin, are repurposed as monstrosities of torture. Finally, rising up to the top of the painting and past the frozen water, a possible allusion to Dante's vision of Lucifer and ice, we see through the soot and darkness the writhing mass of armies. Thus, we realize that as in the Summoner's Tale, though the tormentors of the painting may be demonic, the horrors that they carry out about humanity are in reality the self-inflicted sins of man, the wrath of war and the pride of sovereignty chief among them. Where Bosch's nightmare can be explicated as a moralizing exemplum, Bruegel's 1562 painting, The Triumph of Death, is a far more pessimistic and explicit vision. A bold panorama suffused in a dull, almost monochromatic russet, the painting depicts all sections of society tormented by the legions of death. Here, the search for death by the three youths in the Pardoner's Tale is not needed, for death itself has sought out humanity. The paradox at the center of the image lies in the fact that Bruegel is illustrating a moment of both apocalypse and creation. Certainly, death rounds up and slaughters man, but beyond that, higher up on the canvas and the horizon, we see death felling trees and moving stone, the emblems of construction. Thus, death does not simply extinguish humanity, but replaces it. It's an ordered army, roving across the land, swelling its ranks by stripping the living of their corporeality. And intriguingly, in the image, Bruegel shows no supposition of salvation. Death rules on earth, while God above is absent. God is a complex supposition in racconti di Canterbury. Like Chaucer, Pasolini does not withhold from critiquing and satirizing the material emblems of the church. Take, for example, this scene in The Pardoner's Tale, an edition of Pasolini's, where one of the three youths stands above a crowded tavern, sermonizing on the moral degradations he sees before him, while simultaneously physically enacting a significant portion of this abasement himself. The framing of the shot and his placement above a railing suggests the preacher in his pulpit. Thus, Pasolini mocks and highlights the hypocrisy of a church that was, certainly during his lifetime, a highly repressive institution. Yet within the film there is a sense of profound spirituality, for Pasolini's work is rooted in a specific conception of the sacred, a conception that does not flow from the figures, symbols, and relics of the church, but from the natural expression of life itself. It's the reason why Pasolini chooses to adapt the funniest and bawdiest of Chaucer's tales, and why Bruegel's peasants offer such an evocative lens. It's an ideology that suffuses and defines both the film and Pasolini's cinema as a whole. Pasolini believed that cinema constituted what he termed the written language of reality, a semantic system that reproduces the effect of life in its entirety, as writing reproduces the spoken word. It's a powerful conception, and one that I racconti di Canterbury wholly embodies, with a singular emphasis put upon the gaze of the creator. Indeed, though the film was marketed and received as an easily consumable form of popular cinema, Pasolini would later insist that I racconti di Canterbury, along with Il Decameron and Il Fiore delle Mille e Una Notte, were in truth his most ideological films. For Pasolini finds God in the quotidian and frames it with the lens of a camera. The Canterbury Tales is the story of a pilgrimage, a spiritual journey. and the telling of tales and the act of authorship itself is rendered sacred. Thus, in the film's conclusion, we see Pasolini leaving us with a statement of intent, left in the form of a prayer.